Even before the economic impacts of COVID-19 collapsed the global oil demand, the energy industry faced a complicated and evolving landscape. We had reduction in costs of alternative energy production, shifting governmental policies, and differing public perceptions that were already influencing the energy transition. Tonight, the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston is proud to present Energy, an Honest Conversation. Our discussion tonight includes two sought-after energy voices. First, we have Vivek Chidambaram. He is the Managing Director in Accenture Strategy, focused across the energy value chain. He manages the North American energy strategy business and the global digital practice at the Energy Strategy Group. He's widely published digitally and for business strategy topics, including in places like the World Economic Forum, Houston Chronicle, Fuel Fix, and Gas Monitor. He's also spoken at several energy forums, including CERAWeek, Pemex Drive, the American Energy Society, just amongst a few. Vivek is also a great asset to the World Affairs Council, as he serves as one of our board of directors. Next, we have Michael Rubio. Michael is Chevron's General Manager for Environmental, Social, Governance Engagement. He works closely with Chevron's senior leadership to develop the company's strategy on ESG issues and leads Chevron's outreach to shareholders and stakeholders on ESG matters. He joined Chevron in 2013 as the Manager for State Government Affairs in California, Oregon, and Washington. Prior to joining Chevron, Michael served as California State Senate and emerged as a leader on issues relating to the California Environmental Quality Act. We are so excited that these two great voices have joined us this evening, and we're so thankful for the time that you're going to get to spend with them. Please join me in welcoming Vivek and Michael. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I have been looking forward to this discussion with Michael and yourself and our audience. The way we thought we would tee up the evening today is we said we would hit maybe three topics of discussion. The first one is on the oil shock of 2020, which we are living through. We sort of call it a 1-2 punch because both supply and demand were impacted in such a material fashion. The second one is looking beyond a little bit and saying, if the pricing pressure on the industry is here to stay, and what might be the way in which we might manage that cost pressure. And then the third one is, what are the implications on our path forward as a society, as an energy industry, given the ESG concerns associated with the hydrocarbon value chain. We thought we would keep it to very few slides. We were kind of thinking along the lines of maybe 2 slides, and then a discussion with Michael, and 3 such segments. So let's get started with it. Viri, thank you for getting the first one of that up. As you can see on this page, this year has been nothing short of unprecedented. We've become tired of using that word in some fashion, and it is indeed a 1-2 punch. We had impact that was simply never seen before in terms of demand. We had impact that was building over time in terms of the supply side of the equation. Shale has been a big tailwind to that supply. We had the issue with OPEC Plus flooding the market back in the summer, and at one point the market was unbalanced by about 8-9 million barrels per day. And to put that in context, our typical imbalance is about 1 million barrels, 1.5 million, when we have these sort of major dislocations in the oil market. So something that we had simply never seen in the past. And as an industry, we were financially and operationally challenged for half the year. We are just about getting out of that. We've just about eaten up that inventory. Demand has started to come back. We're seeing all of that happen. But if you had been 6 months back, that was very much the low point for us. higher debt levels going in than any of the other financial crises. As you know, we have these periodic boom and bust cycles, right? Anybody who's been in the industry long enough has seen them, lived them, understands that they are somewhat inevitable, but they do pass. 2008, 2014, 2020, as you see on that picture. But what happened this year was something that hopefully we don't live through as an industry. But it has accelerated many trends. It has allowed us to learn the limits of what we can do. And that is really what we wanted to focus today's discussion on. If you can go on to the next slide, let me present this, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion. Despite what we saw, unprecedented, never seen before, we are seeing recovery in the second half of the year. Very much so. China, of course, recovered first. The rest of the world has recovered after. And we wanted to project forward a little bit and see if the obituary that in some quarters that has been written on the oil and gas space is indeed even possible. And on the left side of this page, you see a little bit of data. And I was just talking to Michael earlier. Rather than opinions, if we start to look at the data and see where it takes us, it doesn't matter which scenario you try to project forward in terms of supply demand in a world as a species where energy is going to be vital to uplift lives. In none of those scenarios do we see oil and gas, hydrocarbons, becoming any less than 50 to 60% of the mix. So we are at 100 million barrels a day. We expect that equivalent demand to grow. Some of that will be covered, no question, by renewables. But in no scenario do we expect that number to fall very much than 50 to 60% of what it is today. That is a massive number, of course. Now, if we see those scenarios play out, doesn't matter which scenario, whether the scenario that plays out can be one that is a 1.5 degree, a 2 degree, or one that starts to improve depending on the ESG impact. We will see some fundamental structural shifts in the industry. This is something that we are aware of, and as an industry we plan on. We will see a shift in purpose and focus from being asset and resource centric to one that needs to take in the more societal and consumer centric view, and we have already started doing that. We will see a shift from very large portfolios that are able to weather those up and downs to smaller and more dynamic portfolios. We will see a shift in volume to digital and technology, making the efficiency much higher in order to soak up for the pressures that come from the decline that you see on the left side of the page. And we will see a shift from being internally focused to value chain focused across the value chain. So let me pause with that, right? This was the first topic of discussion. It is the oil shock of 2020 and what we see going forward. Michael, let me turn it to you to get a bit of your reaction. Let me start with the left end of this page. You have done an incredible amount of work at Chevron in your public life. Do you see that as being roughly right? Have you seen any scenarios where you expect hydrocarbons to be any less than maybe 60% of the energy mix that we see today?
Well, thanks, Vivek, and thanks, Marianne, and the entire World Affairs Council for putting this together. I wish we could do it in person in the great city of Houston, but I guess the second best is to do it virtually and showcase what energy can do, because without energy, we wouldn't be able to gather today as we are. And to answer your question, Vivek, simply is no. And Chevron takes great pride in diversity and inclusion. And why do I start with that? Because I'm a Democratic Latino from the great state of California, the People's Republic of California that I affectionately refer to. And so I grew up, in the democratic and environmental movement. And what you would be led to believe in many circles, and in fact, many of the circles that I still have of acquaintances and friends, the notion that the world is still going to need oil and gas in a Paris-aligned world, because that's what, as global citizens and global companies, we are all striving to achieve, that oil and gas is simply going to go away. I mean, living here in California, I can't tell you how often I go to a cocktail party or a coffee shop, and when people learn I work for Chevron, they say, "Oh, wow, are you concerned that Tesla is going to put you out of business?" And it just simply isn't the case because, well, one, you need oil and gas to make a Tesla car. It still runs on tires last time I checked. But importantly, if you look at this last year, the slide before this and then looking at this mix, I would capture three things, Vivek. Number one, it really showcases that what we do in the oil and gas sector is essential. We've heard a lot about essential workers, essential businesses in 2020, but make no mistake, the oil and gas sector fundamentally is an essential product to the world's prosperity and to goods movement in and around the world, number one. Number two, scenarios and the stuff that we look at are really just forecasting in the future, and they're all wrong. But what we can do is look in the rearview mirror, and 2020 presented a very good stress test for all of us, not only within our sector, but all those that care deeply about being able to provide the world's energy demand, but at the same time with lower carbon providership. And so this was a great stress test that I know we're going to get into a little more throughout this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. The third thing that I would leave Vivek and Marianne, and for those, I looked at the participation list. It's good to see some familiar names on it, so it's good to be with you. But the third thing I would lend or bring up for the discussion today is because of the reality of the infrastructure, the energy demand, and what we know to be true, that is fact-based, doesn't remove us from the responsibility of trying to close the gap between the narrative and the reality. And so what's happening today, and that's why I really commend you for the title of this conversation, In Search of an Honest Conversation, is because when you look at today, there is, culturally, people are trying to say fundamentally oil and gas is bad. And we want to just do away with it. Well, no, that's not the case. We want to actually have the tremendous resource, but with a lower carbon footprint, with a lower carbon intensity, in a more social and responsible way, so that it's good for the environment, good for shareholders, good for people. And, I think therein lies a real win-win. But make no mistake, we do have an awesome responsibility as a sector. And, I'm really proud to work for Chevron because we're right in the middle of that conversation. But those are the three things. One, what we do is essential. Two, this last year was a great stress test. And three, we need to bridge the gap between the narrative and practice and how we can find those win-win opportunities.
Thank you, Michael. One more question before we move into that second chunk.
Yeah.
You talked a bit about energy being essential, and I often think about this as, as a species, what are the two things that matter to us? To me, it's energy and technology. And the way I think about that is, if I had infinite technology, I could pretty much do anything, right? Meaning, to societies that are not used to our technology today, what we do is magic, right? Literally.
Right. Sure.
And similarly, if I had free energy, I could do anything. I could transform anything into anything else. And in that context, your thoughts on the concept over here is that demand will not go away, and the world is energy poor. We in the OECD countries, consume somewhere between 10 and 15% of what the rest of the world consumes. Your thoughts on and studies that you have seen around fundamentally the democratization of energy, and how will that play out over the next 10 years? I would love to hear it.
So Vivek, I would offer up a third thing that we as human species need. And I heard Marianne say, grab your cup of coffee and your drink or your glass of wine. So for those that have a glass of wine in their hand, I would say the third is love, but I guess that's for a different conversation. So, you bring up a really interesting point, because I'll tie it back into the world's effort to try to take us through this energy transition to meet the world's energy demand with a lower carbon footprint. And oftentimes I find, and it's true across the globe, that people in position of power, whether it's an elected official or a regulatory body, they can't make the hard decisions that really are going to affect consumer behavior. They can't raise the price of carbon so high so that, they can't put a $10 per gallon price so that would shift people away from their SUV or F-150, which I drive, to an electric vehicle, right? And so what they instead do is they set these lofty goals and they attach it to timelines. And the one fundamental thing that I have found, Vivek, is that society has failed too often when they put a timeline and an advancement of technology. So they say, and you'll remember this, cellulosic ethanol was the big thing 20 years ago. If we just put enough money, into it, we would somehow crack it. Well, we did in a lab, but we couldn't bring it to scale. And so, but yet government put a timeline on it in certain jurisdictions with the advancement of technology, and it failed. And so it's still, and we're learning it today, even responding to COVID-19. Not to diminish whatsoever the lives that have been lost, the families that have been impacted, but we're finding you can't regulate yourself out of this pandemic. It's science, it's technology, it's innovation, it's the ability to adapt and develop treatments and a vaccine. And we're seeing that today, and it's no different than in our energy transition. It's not going to be regulation. Regulation is going to help to create markets where it's needed. But in order to advance that technology, and critically, and I'll just sum it up with this, Vivek, and you bring it up right, if you go to areas that have affordable and reliable energy, those are areas that traditionally don't have the levels of poverty that, say, the United States or a first world, nation has. I've spent time in Africa and I've lived in villages. You don't have electricity. And it's paramount and it's critical to advancement and the prosperity for human beings and their quality of life. And so energy poverty is a really big subject. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that everybody can enjoy getting on Zoom, let alone have electricity and a fire inside of their house that doesn't put off NOx and SOx and can contaminate the kids' lungs that are inside either the village, the hut, or the makeshift home they have.
Thank you, Michael. Love the answer. So I will add love to the things that we need as a species.
Yeah, there you go.
Absolutely. Viri, let's go on to the next chunk. So I think the summary on that first conversation was, look, demand for energy will not disappear. Hydrocarbon as part of that mix will not disappear to nothing in the foreseeable future. Yes, there will be much more, it'll be a much broader mix. No question about it. It'll be a multipolar energy world, so to speak, rather than a unipolar world that we had 20 years back. But that won't disappear. That, on the other hand, doesn't mean that the cost pressure on energy will disappear. Meaning, we expect to see what we saw this year was a microcosm of how the energy transition might play out, right? The demand will still be there. It'll come back and it'll go away and it'll be volatile. But the cost side of the equation is something that we expect to see continued pressure on. And this is a piece of work that a team that works with me had done with the IEA, with the World Economic Forum. Essentially, it is saying that companies have to get much better at managing the cost of producing a barrel, and if they do that, they can continue to get something like a 12% return, which is what would be demanded. And there will be this constant challenge between renewables going down a cost curve. At some point, they will taper, and oil and gas finding the trapped value that is there in the business that we did not have to find before, frankly, because the pricing manage to give us those uplifts periodically. So we expect to see that over the next 5, 10, 20 years. We'll see this transition where the demand doesn't go away, but the cost, the profitability will be challenged. And that's, I won't read all of those things on the right side of the page. I want to listen to Michael's reactions to some of this. So I'm going to jump maybe into the next slide, Vivek. This piece of work on that cost pressure starts to say, where is that trapped value? And this provides some positive hope for the industry, right? It's also saying, look, demand doesn't go away. Yes, cost is going to be a challenge, but we do have a way to unlock cost that is trapped in the way that we are extracting value today, whether that is in the exploration capex, whether that's in the well capex facilities, and it goes into a lot of detail. If anyone is interested, reach me, and we'll go into we'll geek out into this and dive into how those cost numbers came up. But essentially, there is a lot of trapped value in the industry, and we would expect to see that trapped value get unlocked over time, even as there's pressure on the demand side, right? There'll be the constant pressure. There's likely to be pockets of stranded assets that emerge because of the way that the trapped value would work, but hydrocarbons will stay in the mix. Let me pause there, Michael. Again, sort of dive back to you. You look at a business that is massive, has a footprint that is across the world. What are the things that you worry about, from a profitability perspective rather than from a demand perspective, right? The first part of our conversation, I think it's very clear that the demand wouldn't disappear. It is an essential commodity. Do you see the profitability pressure becoming, ratcheting up? Do you expect to see this cost unlock happening? What is the role of technology in it? All of these are running through my head. I asked you 3 questions, but maybe let's start with the first one. Do you see that cost pressure continuing for an extended period of time this time?
Well, we do, and I really think, I love to listen to our CEO and Chairman Mike Wirth talk about this subject, and given his background in the downstream sector where margins are thin, timing is everything, and it's a great time to have a leader with his skill set. And what he really talks about, Vivek, and I think it's important to highlight here, is that the cyclical nature of this industry. We're in a period today where we have just simply too much product in the world, and it's going to force discipline within a sector that perhaps it's lacked in the recent history. And so there's a couple things. One, you're going to see a shift from volume to value. Everything is focused on returns. And if you look at our sector, and most people that I talk to, particularly in the sustainability space, says, geez, your number one issue is climate change. And we like to agree that climate change is a significant issue, but perhaps a more important issue for our sector today is simply returns. If you can't compete from a return standpoint and beat the cost of capital, you're not going to survive. And I want to remind folks, this isn't Little League Baseball. Not everybody gets a trophy. There are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. And so the good thing, you don't want to ever let a crisis go to waste, so to speak. And so what this last year has just continued to do, because I think we saw in the last couple of years, we were already starting to see a squeeze. And the importance of driving value and profitability, and we're seeing that across the board. We're getting more production in the Permian today with fewer wells or rigs than we have historically, right? And I would never bet against this industry, because we will always find a way to adapt. Now, will there be losers? Absolutely. But will there be winners? Make no mistake. This country, this sector, I think that, I would put my money on it that in the end of the day, we're going to be the ones still plowing or producing, I should say, my farming background, plowing. And it's critical here. And I think it's going to produce a stronger, more profitable sector that can compete around the world and compete then when you talk about just in general the S&P and returns and protecting dividends and wooing back the capital that has shifted away from our sector. It's going to be these types of actions. It's going to be, untapping this value that you've done such a good job to illustrate here, that will start to win over those that are holding on to a lot of capital in the world today, but saying there's too much risk in the oil and gas sector. Well, the way that we can deal with that risk is showing much more discipline, increasing our returns, lowering our carbon. And then, of course, it's always helpful. And we were really very fortunate and blessed and it was a direct result of the great leadership that we have at Chevron to go into this period with a really strong balance sheet. It shows the importance of that as well. So absolutely, I think this is going to play out probably, at least it's not, certainly not over. You'll see it more in 2021, and then perhaps even further than that.
That's Michael, I fully agree with that view of how the industry will change. You said something that intrigued me, and maybe we can talk a bit about that. You talked about the upstream business trying to run like the downstream business. You said it in passing. You said, the downstream has always had this big challenge associated with cost. Upstream didn't typically worry about that because the development of the find usually made up for that in this spiky way. But more and more, and it's an observation, and we can, maybe I have it wrong, we can debate it. More and more, I am seeing the companies, especially the integrated companies, pick the senior leadership that has had a lot more downstream experience than the way that they did it in the past, right? In the past, the explorationist or the driller would typically have more of a chance to make it to the C-suite. I'm seeing more of that phenomenon of that cost downstream mindset in the industry. We have seen that. In fact, one of my roles is managing what we call global ventures and industry solutions. And the industry solution aspect of it is this connectivity that we see, that the strapped value is there. Your thoughts on this would be, I think, super for our audience, right? How does the upstream business start to function with the same mindset as the downstream business? What are sort of the things that have to happen to allow that to flower, so to speak?
Vivek, I would only comment that it's not a downstream versus upstream. It is disciplined leadership and being laser-like focused on returns and costs. I've heard Mike Wirth and Pierre Breber, our CFO, they really emphasize that costs matter. And so when you have that sort of discipline and push it through the culture of an organization, to me, that's more important than whether or not you came up through the ranks of downstream or upstream. And being an outside hire and fairly new, I've worked for Chevron now for almost 9 years. And I say new because the majority of people that work at Chevron have been there 30, 40, 50 years. It's amazing. And so I'm still in large part a rookie compared to some others. But I think what's critical during this period of time is to have leaders with proven track records that they can cut costs, be focused on returns, and also do it in a very responsible and socially ethical way. Because I think culturally now society is demanding on us that they want a return, but they want it also that's promoting prosperity and good around the world. And I would highlight this. If you see if just particularly within our sector, what's happening today, I would highlight something here for you, Vivek. I'll ask you a question.
Of course.
Because I think never before in our history, and I'm fairly limited here, but I would say in the last few decades, if you looked at the strategy of, say, the big 5 integrateds around the world, their strategies relatively look the same, right? Go get resource, be able to execute it, generate the cash flow, cover the dividend, and cash buybacks, et cetera. Today, though, you see a significant divergence in strategies, right? You've got a couple that are now cutting their dividend to invest capital in, say, renewable energy and go down the electrical or utility route. And you have us that are firmly and have always made our number one priority protecting and growing the dividend. And we're not going to cut the dividend to invest in renewables, though we think we have a very important and critical role and part of the solution in the energy transition, but they're different. And so what's really taking shape here is a real Y in the road, almost a Robert Frost path widening, if you will, of two roads that are diverged in the wood. And investors are going to be asked to pick, which direction are they going? Young individuals out of college that are looking to go to work for a company are going to be asked to pick. And so I think, herein lies, I think, an important aspect for our sector. So I'm shifting it just a little bit from downstream versus upstream versus the divergence of strategies. And I wonder if you, in your position, see that as well, or is it just something within, the confines of my office that I'm observing?
It's spot on, Michael. I know that one, by the way. Woods are lovely, dark, and deep, and I have miles to go before I sleep and promises to keep.
Well, that's impressive. See, you do have a little bit of romance in you. Love should be added to your two.
But to get to your question, we actually see sort of three emerging archetypes, so to speak, of an energy company's strategy. One of them is to sort of say, no, I will double down on what has worked for me. This down cycle means that there's not a lot of investments being made, and therefore, if I'm able to make those investments in the up cycle, I will make superior returns, and I would make up for what has happened here. That's one archetype. We see an archetype that is saying, I will become the low carbon specialist in the industry. Right. So the first one is sort of a last man standing archetype. The second one is, no, it's actually a forward looking one. It is, I will become the low carbon specialist. I will actually run my business in an integrated fashion. I will make sure that the cost structure, this trapped value is unlocked, and I'll be a low carbon, and I will do that responsibly because of what actually the next slides that we talk about will be. So that's a second type of archetype. And then you see a bet that is being made, which is saying, no, I'm actually going to completely transition, right? I will completely transition away from hydrocarbons. This is going to happen. The UK is announcing IC engines disappear and so on and so forth. Now, the issue with that, that the challenge with that, so to speak, is liquid fuels aren't the only part of the energy mix, right? So I just because electrification of transportation happens, which I strongly believe will happen, and it will happen in pockets, and you'll see isolated pieces of stranded assets that emerge as a consequence. Despite that, I still believe that 50-60% number will still be there, because it is not just about liquid fuels, it is about everything else.
Yeah, well said.
Super. Viri, let's go to the last chunk. I'm having one eye on the time. I want to make sure our audience gets a bit of time at the end. But this is an interesting conversation, so we're going a little long. You hit a bit on this, Michael. You talked about it is an essential commodity. We understand the cost structure. We see that this cost discipline is going to become super important. It's a cultural change. There's a technology component to that cultural change, as how you manage that business. There's an op model change with it. But there's also a perception that has to get fixed. And this chart to me really knocks on that perception and how that has hit other industries. Let me walk through it real quick. The first one, the left side of this page talks about coal demand. And it talks about coal demand in 2 years, right? 2011 and 2019. As much as we like to believe that coal disappeared, that chart is telling us that demand didn't change very much. Didn't change very much in that period. On the other hand, the market cap of the top 4 coal producers in the US was completely decimated. So the perception of future growth and where investors want to put their dollars totally changed. Totally changed, although the demand didn't change. Back to the way that we structured this discussion, I don't believe that demand will disappear. I do believe that the cost pressure will be there, which then starts to say, what does the industry have to do to prevent what happened on the left side to happen? And if I start to get a little closer to home in the hydrocarbon business, in the oil and gas business, you see a bit of that happening in the OFES space. A lot of the capital that companies carried on the balance sheet, especially in the shale environment, got pushed onto the OFES companies, the oil field services companies, and the market size, the amount of work they were doing, didn't change very much, but the market cap has started to change quite a bit, And you see that in the energy sector more broadly. I said energy and technology were the two most important things for us as a species and love. You start to see what effect we see with those two when those two are getting balanced, right? The incremental dollar from an investor is not going into energy, and we see this in we see symptoms of this in very many different places, Michael. We see it with recruiting. We are a business that looks across industries, and therefore we get a lot of people who have that passion. How many of them continue to go into energy is increasingly challenged, because young people don't want, especially if we stay if this narrative is not changed. Let me do one slide real quick, and then we'll dive into some questions on this. This is a view of what happened this year. We started to see oil demand disappear. We started to see oil demand come back. And then you see emissions, which took a much bigger hit because both gas and oil went down. We see that coming back. On the right side of this page, now the temptation on looking on the left side is to say, hey, we found a way to manage this, and we got our oil demand going back up without the emissions kicking up. So we probably are driving less, but we're using the oil elsewhere, and so on and so forth. But in reality, if you look at the total emissions for the year across transportation, industry, power, and residential, what goes into aviation is actually quite a small number. It's quite a small number. The impact of aviation shutting down is quite minimal on the total amount of emissions that we put out as a planet, as a society. And this tells us that this is not going to be an easy challenge, right? The 640 gigatons that we have put into the atmosphere is not going to, it's not going to be easy to slow the 37, 38 that we're adding every year. And it is incredibly expensive to take out what we've already put in, other than the few measures that we have, which are natural, right? Whether that is reforestation and so on and so forth. Anything else is a challenge. This isn't going to be easy. And these two societal needs from the previous page and this page, economic and societal needs, are going to be super important for us going forward in my mind. With that, let me pause on the slides. I want to get into some discussions with you, Michael. You have done a bunch of work in this space in your role in ESG. Do you see the magic bullet? Are we going to fix this in some fashion that we haven't heard yet? Just talk to us about the things that you've seen.
Vivek, I wish I had a silver bullet. It would be good for our company, but good for our sectors, and more importantly, it'd be good for society, right? And those last two slides, as we've been getting ready for today or this afternoon and evening, I really like those. I commend you and your team for putting them together, because I think they illustrate perhaps one of our greatest challenges, aside from returns that we talked a great deal about today. I said earlier, what we do, what we do is essential. Importantly, too, and I like to be plain spoken and pithy, I'd also say how we do it matters. And what I mean by that is, we have to find a way to produce energy with a lower carbon footprint. And what you just illustrated for all of us is that it is difficult. And prior to COVID-19, I would offer up to people that as the world is getting ready, and I would leave you with this, and I'm really interested in the Q&A that we have, but I would offer up to those that are listening in and are watching that the world's going to get together in 2023. It's the global first stock take to assess the country contributions to determine whether we are really on track to reaching Paris or not. And even with COVID, it's my understanding that we will likely show that we're not on track to reach Paris. This global challenge is significant. It is significantly big in terms of scale. And I think that too often people use this term of, we got to be Paris climate. They've even gone beyond 2 degrees and gone to 1.5 and net zero. And I think the world's going to have a really difficult time to get to 2 degrees or keep the temperature to 2 degrees. increase. And so, you know, I think that really highlights that one of the greatest challenges we have as a society today is how do we truly produce this energy, do so in a way that's good for shareholders so that we don't lose that market cap, even though we're not losing demand, which you illustrate on the first chart, but also meet the world's demand to increase the quality of life for all human beings, whether you're in California, Houston, or Nairobi. And, you know, that is a huge challenge for us. And I've got really dear friends that live in India, and we talk a lot. And you know, the challenge that they have today is the vast majority of the citizens don't have electricity, let alone drive around a Tesla. And so this is a big challenge for us. And I'll tell you, that last slide was an eye opener for me, because you would think with the world shutting down, we would have experienced a significant greater decrease in emissions and then found a way to bring the economy back by keeping those emissions down. And so what we're finding is that's not the case, but we all have to roll up our sleeves and find a way to do it. So well done with those slides, Vivek. And I think it illustrates what we're all going to be working together to try to accomplish in a very, I would end with this, in a competitive world.
That's correct.
Because the oil and gas sector is not like the utility sector, where you have an exclusive operating zone and a guaranteed rate of return, you know, and still in the oil and gas sector, and the gas sector is becoming even more mature from a commodity trading standpoint. It's an open market system where competition is thriving, but we're going to have to find a way to do it, and do it in a way where you can compete.
Absolutely, Michael. I'd love to keep talking with you some more, but I'm going to resist the urge and open it up to questions, Marianne. If you don't have any, just tell me, and we have a lot of things to talk about.
Lots of things to talk about. Vivek, Michael, yeah, we could go on, and there's lots of great questions. Several of them you've touched on briefly, but I'm going to ask them specifically because that's the value that we bring our members. So one of the lessons that you just talked about COVID is that we may not need as much energy in the future. We're all working from home, we're traveling less. So if oil is at 50% of energy supply, could the actual barrels burned be less?
Vivek, you want me to take that one first?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael. Yep.
I would say we don't know. We better be ready for any scenario and have an asset base that is resilient to be able to respond. What COVID has taught us is that we can't predict the future, and we have to be disciplined to be able to be agile and to be able to adjust and have that resilience through these cycles. What it does illustrate, though, I mean, what we are learning is that energy demand, while it did go down, we're seeing that energy, particularly our sector, is closely tied to GDP and the economy. And so as GDP and the economy start to tick back up, you know, we are human beings that like to get around, and we like to socialize. And, you know, I haven't seen my grandmother or grandfather since February, but I'm going to go fly to see them as soon as the vaccine comes out, and I'm sure others will. And the other thing is, and I heard the CEO of Southwest brought this up, that, you know, in 2006 and 2007, that terrible downturn in the economy we had, it took 5 years for business travel to get back to its normal levels. So it will probably take a similar amount of time. But remember, we're not suffering from a financial crisis. This is a pandemic crisis. And so we haven't faced one in modern history. So as soon as vaccines come and we have this conversation over steaks and wine in Houston next year, Marianne, it'll be really interesting to see if we've seen a true uptick in GDP and economies thriving. And then I think what we do see is that energy, if it doesn't significantly grow, it's going to, you know, plateau and stay pretty high for a while. Vivek, you disagree, agree?
No, I agree, Michael. I mean, the numbers on the emissions and the demand is telling us a story that this, yes, no question, a lot more people are working from home, and therefore the commute disappears, right? But it hasn't translated into total energy, not liquid fuels. Absolutely, liquid fuels, no question. But total energy and the emissions, it has gone down, absolutely. But the amount is not as much as we thought it would be when we were in shutdown mode, right? When various countries were going into shutdown mode, and you can see the curve go up and down in it. Uh, uh, my speculation on this is like I said, we don't have all the facts on it, but my speculation on it is that while commute has gone down, we consume a lot more from a logistics perspective that is delivered to us. And that globally is happening, right? You see that, and that logistics eats up some of the benefit from the commute, and therefore the number is smaller. While business travel has disappeared, the amount of travel that is coming, the contribution of travel that is coming from commercial aviation isn't large enough to offset some of the other things that are happening in the economy, right? So commercial aviation is still not back. It's about 60% back in terms of total number of planes and rides, but that component of the contribution of that component to emission doesn't ring the bell, so to speak. And that's really what's happening, right? We saw it disappear, but when it has come back and we compare it year to year, not as big a change as we thought there would be.
We have another question from Michael, from Dennis, and he asks Michael, Michael, you correctly pointed out that not everyone can be a winner, and European oil majors are far more heavily invested in alternative energy, maybe more so than domestic here in the US. Will the American oil majors win or lose with this strategy, or more or less ignoring green energy sources?
So, great question. I hope I give you a great answer. And I think you're going to have to get back to fundamentals. If you invest in renewables but don't generate returns, you're not going to have a sound business. You're not going to be able to strengthen your balance sheet. You're not going to have free cash flow to return cash to shareholders, take care of your employees, manage effectively human capital management, all the things that go into a thriving business. So first and foremost, you're going to have a business that generates returns. And so I think you're seeing the market today be a bit suspect of some within our sector being able to shift their CapEx fundamentally to areas, to energies. Wind and solar is a very competitive business too. It's just as competitive as oil and gas. And there's a lot of people playing in it. And so if the returns, we just fundamentally believe that we are in a better position to generate the returns in oil and gas today. We're also playing in renewables, whether it be biofuels, renewable natural gas, that are really producing a lot of great returns today because of some of the policy-enabled markets like LCFS and other programs, low carbon fuel standard. So I would go back to returns matter, and generating returns, low carbon, we think is going to win the day.
Another question from an anonymous attendee asks, Chevron is taking good steps to improve its climate change performance, your metrics on GHG, methane emissions, etc. But why not take the relatively easy step of leaving trade organizations that undermine climate legislation? It's kind of a tricky question. And why does Chevron not show its direct and indirect climate lobbying expenditure in one location on its website?
So we do. We actually show more than 94% of our total spend on our sustainability side. If you go to chevron.com, click on sustainability tag, go down to our lobbying report, you'll see the 20 plus trade associations for which we do contribute or showcase more than 94% of our total spend in the lobbying space. Pushing policies, it's my background. I was in it for more than 15, 20 years, both elected and as a staff person. I will tell you, isn't black and white. And so, it takes collaboration. It takes an open dialogue. We firmly believe that it's better to be at the table to influence particular groups, like the Business Roundtable, like the United States Chamber of Commerce, who over time have evolved and changed their positions, both about Paris and a price on carbon, all of which Chevron has been a constructive partner in engaging to try to shape those organizations, those trade associations, consistent with our approach and views of the energy transition. And so I will leave you with this. When the state of California wanted to pass a cap and trade program, a price on carbon, the administration at the time came to Chevron, and we worked in a partnership. We took the leadership role. We negotiated that. We're really proud of the policies that have come up of it. It's a price on carbon and one of the largest GDPs in the world. So I would just offer up to the person that asked the question, we have a record leaning in this particular space, and one that I'm particularly proud of.
Another question from Ed asks, how do you see the Biden administration impacting policy changes regarding energy transition?
Well, I think he's going to fulfill his commitment and get back into the Paris Agreement on day one, which Chevron supports the Paris Agreement. And Chevron's been around 140 years. And so we've worked with Democrats, Republicans, we've worked with governments all around the world. We look forward to working with the Biden administration, and someone who I am quite fond of, Kamala Harris, who I had the pleasure of working with in the state of California. Being headquartered in California, being roughly 80 miles from Sacramento, California, I think gives us a little bit of competitive advantage in working with Democrats and working with Republicans on these important issues. And so we do think the Biden administration is going to lean in, sign back into the Paris Agreement, move forward with policies. We look forward to working with the administration, presenting the facts and helping being part of the solution.
One of the questions focuses on something we haven't touched on, and maybe I can get Vivek first, and then Michael, you can comment on this. We just have a few short minutes left. Specifically for Michael, will Chevron re-enter geothermal? We haven't talked about geothermal at all. So Vivek, your thoughts on geothermal, emissions-free renewable energy development, and then we'll shift it over from a Chevron perspective.
Sure. I mean, it is one of those that seem to offer huge potential, so to speak, Marianne. But the issue has been practicality, right? The issue has always been about how do you make the economics of it work, and we have not cracked that so far. Would we some point in the near future? I see other technologies being more likely than cracking geothermal, and any number can come to mind. The solar panel efficiency is commercially maybe 21, 22, 23% today. There's an SQ limit as to how far it can get with one layer, but you're starting to see multi-layer solar panel technology, right? For example, you're starting to see vertical axis windmills. I think those will be more economic than cracking geothermal at scale in the near future. Now, I expect to see certain pockets of the world being much more relevant from a geothermal perspective, but not broadly. Michael, I don't know if you've seen something different in the numbers.
Yeah, we've got a long history in geothermal. We were at one point, if not the largest, one of the largest geothermal producers in the world, and so we're still looking at it. But Marianne, it's real simple. It's got to compete. Got to compete for capital in the end of the day, and we have a really good portfolio right now that we're very proud of, and so it would have to compete just as hydrogen would have to compete, and we're looking at that because that's got a promising future. So we're looking at all the above. Carbon capture and sequestration utilization is a very important technology the world's going to need. We're looking at all of this stuff, but in the end of the day, it just simply has to compete.
A question for you, Michael. The U.S. Congress is at best lukewarm on putting a price on carbon. Democrats blame the oil industry for opposing the price on carbon. Republicans talk about government overreach. Does Chevron lobby for a price on carbon in the U.S. Congress?
Yeah, as I told you, making bills or legislation is messy. Yeah, so everyone's pointing the finger. Yes, anyone who is in elected capacity and has a desire to talk about a price on carbon, we think it's the most effective way to get to scope 3 emissions, or the end consumer emissions. So we talk about it in the United States Congress, the Senate. We talk about it internationally with governments in Singapore. And then we talk about it at the state region, obviously, with our experience in helping pass one of the largest ones in the state of California. So we're engaged with it. And we think, I think a chart earlier that showed in that barrel a $50 price on carbon. This is a real challenge. And the other area that we're engaging, importantly, Marianne, and for the person that asked the question, is at the next COP26. And just this year in Madrid, we had representatives from Chevron trying to work out a consensus on Article 6, which we all know we've got to get a consensus on if we're going to have a global emissions trading system, accounting system. This is all very important. And I would say this, to put the power in the hands of the consumer. That's where it ultimately needs to get so that we can find real meaningful progress to try to bend the curve, not to COVID cases, but bend the curve to emissions around the world.
Gentlemen, this has been so interesting. I wish we could have another 30 or 40 minutes, maybe an hour or so to talk about this. And I'll take you up on that steak and wine later in Houston when you come back.
Looking forward to it.
Any closing comments, Vivek? You have done a great job in facilitating and coordinating a dynamic dialogue. Any closing comments from you?
No, Marianne, it is an industry that is not sunsetting very clearly, but there are challenges and there are responsibilities to society that are going to become more and more important for us.
Thank you, Vivek. And lastly, Michael, I'm going to end with a question I got from one of our board members. How do we persuade Chevron to finally move to Texas?
Well, that's a conversation you got to take up with Mike Wirth, our CEO and chairman. Being in California, I think I said it earlier, it does give us a unique perspective, somewhat of a competitive advantage, particularly where we're going with energy transition. But Marianne, I would just sum up, thank you very much for inviting Chevron to be part of this great conversation with Vivek and the great work that he and his team did. And I would like to give an open invitation. Folks can find me online, whether it's LinkedIn or just go into our website. If you've got additional questions, if you've got ideas and thoughts on how we can do better, whether it's disclosure, sustainability practices, please let us know. We are always looking to strive to get better in this particular space, and we value everyone's feedback and thoughts.
Vivek, Michael, we thank both you and Chevron and Accenture for being such great partners. The World Affairs Council is all about giving back to our community and providing great global education to Houston. I hope each of you who attended will take a moment to join us for our wonderful program with Rick Steves and give back to your community. It's important. Houston is a giving city. I'm sure someone in California is too. And we hope to see all of you at our next program very, very soon. Gentlemen, thank you again. To everyone, have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.